Welcome to episode 7 of our Garden States Microdose, proudly presented by Entheogenesis Australis. And the monthly webcasts have been leading us ever closer to Garden States, and we'll have an update on what's going on with Garden States shortly. I'm broadcasting from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and would like to pay my respects to elders past and present, as well as anyone who might be tuned in today. I'd also like to recognise that we benefit from the knowledge and insights of First Nations people, including their long relationships with the plants and fungi we revere from around the world. I acknowledge that knowledge of First Nations people has often been obtained disrespectfully and call on all of our community to understand and recognise different cultural protocols to show our respect. Sovereignty was never ceded. EGA is closing in on its 20th official year of operations, providing opportunities for critical thinking and knowledge sharing on the interface between plants, fungi, mind, and culture. EGA truly embraces psychedelic in the broadest sense of the word and beyond into science, culture, policy, and nurturing the communal undergrowth that holds all of this together. And make sure to stay up to date with everything that is coming from EGA, the website here, entheogenesis.org/connect. Sign up for the newsletter. There should have been a newsletter in your inbox recently if you are signed up to it. And if you are a ticket holder for the event, you would have got an update about that as well. While you're at the website, there are some beautifully put together and informationally dense resources. The first that was released, we're sort of going into spring now, so it's not really fungi season or a psilocybe season anymore, but you can still grab that resource. Highly recommend it. Pass it on to anybody that might be interested, friends, family, whoever's interested. And the latest resource is the peyote conservation reference guide, which is an interesting insight into peyote in Australia, threatened, but no one's sure what to do about it. So find out more, grab that resource, and you can get up to date. Make sure to hit subscribe to the EGA YouTube channel if you haven't already, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And if you're watching this later, the conversation also continues out in that social world. So do follow along with us on whatever your platform of choice is. Going now to our first speaker and our introduction to tonight, psychedelic harm reduction and trip sitting, Liam with a presentation. Liam.
Hey.
Hey.
So I'm going to talk about try to set the scene for the discussion tonight. I really think the meat of what's going to be said is going to kind of come out in a chat between the four of us. But I think what kind of will get the ball rolling, we'll be talking about this study that Steve and I and another colleague, Sasha, recently did. And it's kind of responding to a research gap that we've seen, and that's around this concept of psychedelic harm reduction. So all the new hype that's happening around psychedelics currently is really closely associated with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And that's all well and good, but there's also this big cultural phenomenon of a lot of more people taking psychedelics. And even though they're not in a psychotherapy setting, we still need to know how to care for them. There's a couple of kind of manuals that have quite good and been built from community experience that we can use to inform that practice, but there's still not really a strong evidence base. And that's, pretty much because it's hard to collect data on people that are using psychedelics. It's legally complex and ethically fraught. So that's why we use the internet, because there's a whole public discussion that we can draw on to try to understand that. So to do that, we looked at two kind of, there's a lot of drug forums out there, but we wanted to look ones that were like psychedelic focused. And so we chose the DMT Nexus and the Shroomery. They both have slightly different focuses. Obviously, DMT Nexus is focused on more so DMT, and the Shroomery is focused more so on psilocybin mushrooms. But they still have this kind of interest in other psychedelic substances as well. So rather than to use the search engines on those websites, which are normally quite annoying and difficult to use, like they might only let you do so many searches in a period of time or just be inconsistent, we use Google, and we use Google to search those websites with that little phrase you can see in brackets there. And we replaced search term, which you can see in italics, in each of those search terms in that list below. And our goal in doing that was to identify each post within those forums that talked about trip sitting. And then we'd copy and paste that post into an Excel sheet. And then we ended up with a bit over 1,300 posts. And to kind of deal with all that data, we did what is called a thematic analysis, which you can describe in like a lot of complicated, wordy terms. But I think to keep it simple, it's basically like putting those posts into categories, because I can't read every one of those 1,300 posts to you right now, but I can tell you the key categories that we put them into to kind of understand this bulk of information around trip sitting. And, that process basically involved myself and Sasha separately reading all of those posts, separately assigning themes or categories to them, and then coming together and kind of debating over those themes to decide on which were the same, which were different, and which we were going to agree on to organize all this data. So there were two we're trying to write a few papers out of this. None of them have been accepted yet. But I think the easiest way to then, so say these 1,300 posts or so, they come down to maybe 50 or so themes. And I think I can break those themes into two areas, which are useful, I hope, for the kind of people that are watching this webcast, which I think are probably people that want to care better for people that are using psychedelics. And those two areas, one is what's the background or history or experience of someone, and what are the preferences for those backgrounds amongst people on these forums, and what are their preferences for the qualities in those people. So rather than their experience, more so their behaviors kind of real time around the psychedelic experience. And again, I'm just really wanting to stimulate some thought that's going to lead into the discussion, maybe some questions from you guys, maybe some debate amongst us. And I think the easiest way, because these are the themes, right? In bold, each of those bold terms is the theme. And then in brackets after that, each is a sub-theme. So the overarching theme for the background and experience that people wanted in trip sitters was people that had experience. And something we were thinking about that's common in the literature around other drugs is like peer support services. And we were kind of wondering, are trip sitters supposed to have psychedelic experiences? What's, views on this? And we found that kind of non-surprisingly, that yes, there was demand for this. But interestingly, there was often a demand not just for psychedelic experience in general, but specifically for a type of psychedelic. 5-MeO DMT, for example, the effects are a bit different to other psychedelics. You might be more likely to see behavior like unconsciousness or vomiting or things like that, and you don't want someone to freak out when they see that. But also in situations where people couldn't find someone that had the psychedelic experience that they wanted in a sitter, experience in other altered states or mysticism or, religious practices, kind of esotericism or whatever, those kind of views and interests were seen as an alternative way of finding, a desirable quality in a sitter. And people also wanted experience in health, information around drugs and drug education, and experience providing sitting as well, like not just having experience using the psychedelic, but also having experience caring for someone under the influence of psychedelics as a separate thing. And then as well, there was this interesting kind of, I don't know if it's quite a divide, but just different views on if you wanted a sober sitter. Obviously, I'm sure Steph always, as a dance-wise, always have a sitter. And that's the line that you have to take, because that's the safest option, and you'd never want to encourage someone not to do it. But harm reduction, people always do the thing that they're going to do, and then you've got to move forward and try to deal with that. So how do we mitigate people that don't want to have a sober sitter, even though that can provide some safety, comfort, because it does have pitfalls for some people of inducing anxiety. People, are just feel weird because they're under the influence and the other person isn't, or B, the person that's caring may be uncomfortable because the person's acting strangely and then project that onto the experience. So you can see why people are concerned of a sober sitter. And there were some strategies of choosing a co-consumer as a way of trying to, have a harm reduction approach. And there was demand for things like how to choose someone to do that, and like things like pre-existing relationships was good. But I think the most interesting thing in that regard was people using microdosing as a way to still sit without being sober. And I thought that was kind of interesting. And now the other thematic area in terms of qualities that you want to see in a sitter, maybe that might help you choose someone, and things that you might want to see in their provision of the experience. Again, the primary themes are all in bold, and I won't read all the sub-themes, but I might delineate a few things just to make them more clear. I think presence is obvious, right? You want someone who's there, but maybe the one confusing sub-theme is this idea of existential. And that's broke into two additional sub-themes. But basically, it's this idea of either directing the experience, which might be more an approach of using psychedelics in a cultural context where you're trying to engage with this, construct, which we would call holding space, guiding someone through that existential experience. Whereas grounding would be more trying to bring someone back to their, current, more collectively agreed reality of an experience. And there were different approaches on doing that in different contexts, and we'll talk about that some more. I think empathy is clear. You want someone that's empathic. Trust. There was this weird thing about it both being good to have a pre-existing relationship with someone to build that trust, but also in situations like festival settings and spontaneous drug use, how can you ensure that your sitter has a pre-existing relationship? But that does help make the situation more predictable. And even though I said there was this existential split between grounding and hold space, where some people did want someone to, guide them through this existential place, there was, I'd say, a stronger emphasis for this non-intrusive approach, which I would think is more of a grounding approach, in which people don't tell you what to think, don't ask you too many questions, don't get all up in your experience. They're just kind of there as a support network. Another useful thing that I thought was quite interesting was having a discussion of boundary setting before. Some people will want you to change their clothes when they're covered in vomit. Some won't. Should probably figure that out beforehand. There was a long list of different things that we could protect people from, hot pipes and lighters, glass, things like that, and various tasks that maybe you'd want assistance with when you're under the influence of psychedelics, because your motor skills might be a bit gone or whatever. So basic stuff, eating, going to the toilet, whatever. And maybe most interestingly to a COVID situation, and really relevant to an online forum, was this concept of lots of people, like I was saying, were kind of scared of having a sober sitter, or even scared of having a sitter at all, because they're worried that's going to make them overthink the situation. So they were using different ways to try to have the safety mechanism of someone knowing what they were doing and maybe monitoring them in some way without actually being there. And so the obvious classic approach is, same as bushwalking, right? Tell someone where you're going. And another approach, that the nearby thing means have someone in a different room, or maybe if you had a neighbor that was cool, you could tell your neighbor. Online would be you could have a webcam stream or just someone you were checking in via chat, and phone is kind of the same thing, just different ways people were trying to have this remote sitter, have this solo experience in a safe way. And I think I've said enough. Thank you.
I'm going to formally introduce our panel for this evening. First on the list is Dr. Stephen Bright, Senior Lecturer in Drug Studies at Edith Cowan University, Director of Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine, PRISM, that's PRISM, as you can see on the screen, and Director at Students for Sensible Drug Policy, Editor at AOD Media Watch, aodmediawatch.com.au. Stephen, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Steph Tzanetis. Steph is the DanceWise Program Director at Harm Reduction Victoria, a Director at Drug Policy Australia, and Director at Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine, or PRISM. And you can get her at steph@dancewise.org.au. Steph, welcome.
Hey, thank you so much.
And finally, who we heard from earlier, Dr. Liam Engel. Liam is Adjunct Research Fellow at Edith Cowan University, a Research Officer at RMIT University, Associate Editor of AOD Media Watch. That's aodmediawatch.com.au, and our handy moderators will drop that link into the chat as well. And a contributor with EGA. Liam, welcome.
Hello again.
All right, so let's get to our first questions. Let's just get down to the basics. What different types of trip sitting do you recognise? So psychedelic experiences come in many forms, and there might be different approaches that you might take to how to work with people. Whoever would like to begin us off can take it.
Well, I'd just like to say that my approach to trip sitting, I hadn't really thought about it in categories. I hadn't really categorized it. But hearing what Liam was describing in the presentation just before, the presentation B just gave, which was an introduction to psychedelic harm reduction, I think I refer to the trip sitting principles, and it's probably closest to a non-directive approach to trip sitting.
Go on, Steve.
Well, I guess the opposite of that would be really guided trip sitting. So if you participate in an ayahuasca ceremony, there may be, to varying degrees depending on the facilitator or facilitators, different levels of guidance to that. And I think what was really interesting with the research was the tension there between grounding and holding space, because for me, trip sitting is really finding that balance between holding space and grounding. And holding space is taking sort of a calm approach, because people that are under the influence of a psychedelic are quite suggestible, and so they'll pick up on micro gestures. And so if you panic, they panic, and so one needs to be calm. But you're present with the person. You're doing sometimes by not doing. There's often a lot of empathic listening, so it's not guided. It's sitting, it's holding, and it requires patience and openness, and it requires trust from both the person who is consuming the psychedelic and the person that's trip sitting. It requires you both to trust in the process that's unfolding, and that there's some sort of healing intelligence or some sort of intelligence to what's going on to it, and allowing that to just unfold as it unfolds.
So maybe we have this non-directive kind of dance-wire style of trip sitting, this guided or influenced style of trip sitting. And I think obviously then there's the third type, which people may or may not call trip sitting, and that's psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And then if we think of that concept of remote sitting that we were talking about, I think that could play into probably potentially all three of those styles.
Mm-hmm.
Just a quick technical comment. Somebody has just asked, Steve, if you can point your microphone towards your mouth a little bit more, but we'll continue on. Now, the past decade or two, I'd say most of the 21st century, with the rise of internet, especially the rise of social media, but the rise of being able to connect and share information in ways that we hadn't been able to before, has given rise to the psychedelic renaissance. We've seen a growth in psychedelic research. We've seen changes to psychedelic policy, especially in the US, which is, funnily enough, the reason why we have psychedelic prohibition in Australia in the first place. But perhaps that's another story. So how does psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy relate to this space, the space of the psychedelic renaissance? Steve?
Well, I have a love-hate relationship with this term psychedelic renaissance, because people have been using psychedelic plants and compounds for thousands of years. And so in many respects, this is the second psychedelic renaissance. It's the third wave of psychedelic research, if we include that that use prior to it being introduced into the Western conscious. And, you know, even if in that second wave of Western use of psychedelics, it was often conducted in the context of trying to assist individuals with mental health conditions, substance use disorders, and so already in that research happening in the 60s and 70s, there was a focus on developing psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, although it wasn't really called that at the time. It's been rebranded, I guess, as psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy in the current wave. And in the current wave, it didn't come instantly, because the first wave of research was, you know, Strassman injecting people with dimethyltryptamine, and then the John Hopkins research looking at the potential for psilocybin to occasion mystical experiences, in which they were starting to think about set and setting. And then it's really ramped up in the last few years to a real focus on psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, so much so that really that people almost associate the psychedelic renaissance with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy and vice versa.
And with trip sitting, how does trip sitting relate to psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy and psychedelic renaissance as well? And I'll open that to anybody who would like to answer that one.
Well, I'll start. For me, one of the key differences is that psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, as we know it now, involves preparation to prepare the person both in terms of their mental state, their intention, and also preparing the setting for which the drug-assisted sessions are going to occur, and it involves integration. And so, for me, part of my apprenticeship, I like to call it, in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy has come from the harm reduction work that I've done with Steph at DanceWise, where there isn't preparation. You don't know what the person's taken. You don't know what their psychological background is. There's no negotiation made around around touch. And so you need to develop trust with the individual very quickly. And in many respects, I think that's far more difficult to do than setting up the conditions in which you're going to maximize the benefit of the person's experience under the influence of the psychedelic for a positive therapeutic outcome. So to me, that's one of the big differences, is that with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, there's a lot more time to prepare people to find out, to learn what their intention is. And when you're actually engaged in the trip sitting itself, reminding the person of what their intention was, and that might be done through the setting in which it's been done, where there might be an altar where a person can put things that remind them of their intention of what psychedelic, of what the session is for them. And so I think for me, the apprenticeship and the learning and the experience that I got through doing that harm reduction work has been invaluable.
Yeah, I think it's important to be aware of just the historical progression from the early research in the 20th century that got cut short due to the war on drugs, and how once like LSD and other psychedelics got used in the community, and there were adverse reactions that led to psychedelic harm reduction being developed. And now we're at a point where there's a resurgence of research and recognizing the potential medicinal benefits using psychedelics as an aid for psychotherapies. But in the actual process of trip sitting with someone, I think it's very important to not to stress too much about, or not get into your head too much. It's helpful to just sort of minimize your ego, maximize your empathy, and just be really present. So it's useful to be aware of the history, be aware of the politics, but in the moment that you're trip sitting, just let it all go, and because it's not about you. And you're bearing witness to someone else's experience and trying to insulate them from any harm.
Creating someone else's work here. It's by a guy called Chris Elcock. Great idea. But it's like this shift from this, what he calls a shift from the psychedelic movement to the entheogenic movement. And the thing about the psychedelic movement was that it was really countercultural. And that kind of resulted in generating a lot of public resentment towards psychedelics. Whereas now this entheogenic movement is more about being integrative and kind of framing psychedelics in a more positive light, which in lots of ways I think is important and good, but part of the outcome of that is using psychedelic therapy as a tool to promote drug reform, which is all well and good, but it results in having a better understanding of psychedelic therapy than trip sitting because no one's able to look at this recreational setting. So I think, a side effect of this entheogenic approach and of the psychedelic renaissance is this overemphasis on clinical settings, probably at the disadvantage of the psychedelic community in the short term, but hopefully in the long term, it generates benefits for everyone.
And it's almost like the research, and I have to say, seeing my name on that your presentation at the start, you and Sasha did all of the heavy lifting with that research. We had some conversations and helped unpack the themes. But for me, what I really like about that piece of research, and it's still ongoing, is it's sort of going full circle from what Steph was talking about, where that psychedelics were being used to treat certain conditions. They kind of escaped the laboratory, and people were using them en masse, and organically harm reduction services set up that learned knowledge that was able to be passed on to other people. And that's then continued. And now with the psychedelic renaissance and psychedelic therapy happening again, I think some of that knowledge can be fed back into the work that's happening in the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy space. So it almost brings the whole thing full circle. And I agree with what you're saying as well, Liam. I find it very difficult when I'm doing media interviews because part of me wants to not push or perpetuate that division between recreational and therapeutic or clinical use of psychedelics or any drugs really, because what is the difference? What's the difference between recreational and therapeutic use? But I feel that I often have to, because I'm trying to persuade often conservative audiences that this is something that we should be doing. And I think it helps reduce some of the anxiety among the public that we're not going to see that psychedelic movement again, because fortunately we do have this entheogenic movement now that we've entered.
Mm-hmm. And that's why a lot of people in the community were against the rescheduling of MDMA and psilocybin, not because we're not in favor of decriminalization and perhaps change beyond that, but if we make that move, then we're being bad scientists, and that is not playing into this entheogenic law reform technique.
Just a couple
of... I feel like there's been a lot of conflation there as well, that the rescheduling had nothing to do with decriminalisation. These are two separate things.
Yeah, exactly.
And PRISM as an organisation is fully for decriminalisation of drugs. We're for evidence-based drug policy, yet at the same time, when I'm speaking on behalf of PRISM to a TV or radio audience, I have to make this distinction between clinical and recreational use, which I find it very clunky and clumsy, and it means that I'm not being authentic.
Yeah,
there was
I think one of the biggest distinctions has to be that when it comes to use in a clinical setting, you get pharmaceutical quality gear, and so that is incredibly useful from a harm reduction perspective, because using from an unregulated market, like it's hard to set an intention or know what you're getting.
But even, yeah, so I think that's one way of distinguishing it, and the other is the intention. So if the intention is to have fun, then go out and have fun, that's fine. And if the intention is personal growth or the intention is to address trauma, then, but it's a really arbitrary distinction based on prohibition and quality control, or lack thereof quality control, and the intention the person has for having that experience.
Just a couple of comments as we're moving along. Thank you to the lively discussion that's going along in the YouTube comment section as well. There was a couple of comments.
What do you got for us, Nick?
Sorry. A bit and a bit of
I can take over and moderate for a moment.
All right.
So Steph, and Liam might be able to talk to this too, because I know Liam's travelled overseas. How does trip sitting and harm reduction, psychedelic harm reduction, how does that sort of look at Australian festivals compared to international festivals?
Yeah, so Liam and I, we both worked at...
Tell them where you've worked, Steph. You've gone everywhere. Go on. We didn't hear about me. What have you done?
So if I was to compare Australian and New Zealand festivals, I would say that Australians have a tendency to get on it pretty hard. And there is a lot of alcohol use going, which alters the role of the trip sitter, because someone might be having a psychedelic, they might be taking LSD and having a few drinks with that, or more than just a few drinks, and not realizing that can have a body load effect, that there ends up being a lot more vomit. So quite literally, the mils of vomit that we would capture on site doing trip sitting and harm reduction support at a festival in Australia is a lot larger than an event 4 times its size, for example, with Cosmic Care Association at Boom Festival. So just that polydrug use, the prevalence of polydrug use and the prevalence of alcohol consumption really does alter the role of trip sitting in Australia. Something else I think I observed when comparing the work we do in Australia to what goes on in Portugal, there does just seem to be less of a sort of prohibitionist agenda, less punitive approach to drug use. There's less police just visible on site at festivals. We probably have the most policed festivals in the world in Australia. And then the weather is quite unique in Australia as well. We get some really hot, dry days, and that's just something to be mindful of, especially since the festivals that you might go to, the multi-days in Australia, are more remote than the camping festivals that you might go to in Europe. We could be a couple of 100 kilometres away from a built-up area compared to usually no more than about 30 minutes, even if it feels reasonably remote at some European festivals. Yeah, what was your take, Liam?
Did you mention policing? Obviously, yes. Policing in Portugal is a somewhat of a different situation, particularly in New South Wales, even in comparison to Victoria. So it was, I think I saw at ZNA gathering in Portugal, like 2 police officers in the 14-day festival on a single day. And I also saw people blatantly doing drugs in front of those police officers. And, ultimately that's a nice thing to see because they're focusing on, more important things with their time. Yeah. Also, something that I've never dealt with at a doof here, I don't know what to call it, like a small scale viral thing spread through the festival and it had to close early because all the portaloos got clogged. It was absolutely wild. I've never had that here. I imagine that, less social resources in Portugal. I'm not sure what other factors played into that, but nightmare.
Yeah. That is something that Australia does really well is we do have an incredible festival industry, some really highly skilled individuals who definitely needs more recognition and support right now with the restrictions and the lockdowns and how that's impacting the scene here in Australia, because they do incredible work. And the risk management approach to festivals in Australia is excellent. So you do have generally the capacity of health providers to deal with higher acuity health presentations, so that response to medical presentations is generally excellent on site at Australian festivals. But it can mean that the psychedelic support that's offered, the harm reduction support needs to kind of fit in with that clinical model, which can make it a little bit more maybe a bit more abrasive than what I kind of describe as quite a soft and incredibly comprehensive psychedelic support service on site at boom festivals and other examples in Europe and in Canada, North America. Yeah.
I wonder if some of that risk mitigation that we have in Australia is because of the different culture. Something I heard you say, Steph, and Liam, you might have mentioned this as well, is just the amount of alcohol that's consumed at festivals in Australia compared to overseas. Australia has a real problem with drinking. We need to address our relationship with alcohol. And I used to think this was because we don't have, an initiation ritual or an adulthood ritual like other cultures do. Our ritual is just to get really fucked up. And we tend to then apply that to our other drug use behaviour, so that you end up with polydrug use and can end up with quite messy presentations. And the thing I was thinking as you were saying all of this, through my own experience with working with DanceWise, is trying to manage people that may only have alcohol on board, but they are so intoxicated that they basically are bouncing between the medical team and the DanceWise team. And is that trip sitting? What is that? Because it's annoying.
I just describe that as harm reduction support, because DanceWise isn't limited to just psychedelic support, but our training and I suppose our history, the origins of DanceWise as a grassroots movement does come from the doof scene, and that's a space that's always nurtured psychedelic culture. But then, the program has fused with the health rights harm reduction movement, which comes more from people who inject drugs and the HIV and AIDS epidemic of the 1980s. So it's really a synthesis of those two approaches to drug use. I would just describe it as harm reduction support. And I think that the principles of trip sitting, they can, essentially be applied to any substance, and they are respectful of a person that's in an altered state. So, you do need a few extra things, including gloves and vomit bags. So, and you articulated it in a much nicer way than I had in my head, because I almost feel like for those individuals that the harm reduction services are babysitting. They're not trip sitting, they're babysitting.
I just want to check if you guys can hear me first up, because I believe you couldn't hear me before. Yep, you can hear me now. Everyone else could hear before, by the way, so it was working. But just a couple of comments from the chat, and do keep those comments going in the chat section. It's been really great discussion so far. There was a little bit of discussion before about whether or not people think that there's formal certification required for trip sitting, what kind of regulation could exist discussed in the future. Some people saying that they disagree with the idea of having formal certification. And then, of course, the real nuanced discussion is there probably is a role for formal certification in some circumstances. And what are those circumstances? We'll get into a little bit more of that, but it's really great discussion. So keep that up in the comment section. But if trip sitting is one form of psychedelic harm reduction, what other forms of psychedelic harm reduction are there? So I suppose we are now touching on this issue. How else can we help people or work with people when they are in a psychedelic state?
So once they're in that psychedelic state, then
let's start with once they're in it, and then we can cover, because then there's also what to do afterward in the hours, days, weeks, months afterwards. But let's start with during the experience.
So during the I was just going to say, during the experience, some of the most useful tools are things that exist within the person. For example, just returning to breath. That can be one of the most powerful ways to essentially work your own way through a challenging psychedelic experience. Some of the other things that, you creating a safe space, whatever that might be, being around people that are projecting a sense of calm, trying to, find your own internal sense of calm. Other things that I think are really useful can be drinking water, just something that's quite grounding, getting comfortable. Got damp socks on, that can really kill your buzz, but you might want to take your shoes off completely and ground yourself, just connect with the earth. Some really basic things, just getting comfortable, connecting, grounding, drinking water, and breathing, ideally through your nose, deep belly breathing. But they're some of the things that you can do, and just making sure that the stimuli around you, whatever you can control, try bring it to a calming sort of pace.
Yeah, and I think it's trip sitters and consumption spaces. Simply, that's what you need during the experience. Steph gave a lot of nuance on how to deliver that. But I think there's probably more harm reduction resources that are available outside of the experience, because education, preparation, integration, the gear that you need to dose properly, the gear that you need to check your drugs, all of these things are important as well. But obviously you don't have access to them during your experience. It's too late.
I think in terms of the actual trip sitting, for me this is where the intersect and the demarcation between harm reduction, psychedelic work, and trip sitting and psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy really intersect, and that they very much is much of the same. And so Yanis Phelps has developed the 6 core competencies of a psychedelic-assisted psychotherapist, and I think they apply to whether you're working in a harm reduction environment or you're working in a clinical environment. So the first competency is empathic abiding presence, which we talked about, holding space. The second is being able to trust in the process, be able to develop trust with the client or the patient or the person that's in your care. The third competence is spiritual intelligence, and understanding that from perhaps through knowledge of psychedelics themselves, which is the next competency, knowledge of the psychological effects. And going back to right to the start to that presentation, Liam, you were sort of talking about the preference people have for trip sitters who have knowledge in that space. And I think that applies to psychedelic assisted psychotherapy as well. So for example, Bill Richards, who was both in the first wave of psychedelic research and developed psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy in the psychedelic renaissance, says besides gaining knowledge of the different terrains within the mind, which is likely to increase the practitioner's empathy and effectiveness when working with future patients, sensitivity to the potency of factors such as trust, honesty, courage, and openness is likely to be enhanced through past experience with psychedelic drugs. The fifth competency is therapist self-awareness and ethical integrity. And I think that's a really important one. So there's a code of ethics for spiritual guides from the Center of, I think it's Spiritual Practice, which was Bob Jesse founded and published in these guidelines in 1995. And they are intention, serving society, serving individuals, competence, integrity, quiet presence, not-for-profit, tolerance, and peer review. And the final competency is, I've lost it. Is to be present, I guess, and not get lost.
Yeah, checks out.
Liam, did you want to add anything on different forms of psychedelic harm reduction?
Well, I think the one thing we didn't get into, because we did have a little discussion around this earlier, and Steph took it to an extreme, which I think really hammers the point home, and I don't want to steal it too much. But we were talking about the idea of integrating psychedelic experiences, and there almost comes a point when you can't integrate an experience into a society that's fucked. And so basically we need a value shift. That's the real harm reduction resource we need. And that obviously includes something other than prohibition, but it is also bigger than that. It's how we treat people that are different, and people that are, particularly people that are different and vulnerable, such as someone under the influence of psychedelics.
Yeah, so shift in values would create a great setting to use psychedelics in. More love, empathy, kindness in the world.
How many bad trips seem to be generated by people worried about the cops or emergency services? I swear I've marked so many experience reports on Erowid, cared for so many people messed up, and I reckon it's got to be at least 50% of people's bad trips are worried about the cops or going crazy. And those things are just, I think, social projections, right?
Yeah, that is something like that need to cling to your mind and your control of it, and just worrying. I suppose worrying about being stigmatized and judged. That guilt.
Just in the comments as well, just wanted to add that there were a bit of some people talking about whether or not having some kind of a sort of an introduction into psychedelics, like hang on, I'll find the exact words that somebody had.
Well, while you're finding them, Nick, I was actually thinking this as well. Twofold. One is the integration and that harm reduction services are starting to do now. It's almost replicating that psychotherapeutic model. And while I'm not aware of any data, certainly my anecdotal experience of being in that space with people who are coming out and are so happy and joyful to have, and so thankful and grateful that you'd hold their hand for 2 hours and not really done much other than just hold space and be present with them and listen to them for that period of time. There seems to be some therapeutic benefit there. And then, talking to them around the role that integration might play in being able to further extend the benefits from that. So it's not just an epiphany that a person's had on the dance floor at a doof. It's something that actually is meaningful and leads to meaningful change in their life. And then backtracking further is that preparation. I think we need more education resources. We need more opportunities for people to engage in preparation. And, EGA, what we're doing here is an example of that. The Australian Psychedelic Society, in Perth, we've been running an Altered States Forum, which has been really focused on providing people with that background information so that they are prepared for an experience, even if they've had one before, that they can go into it in a more prepared fashion. I guess my concern with the preparation side of things and getting the information out there is just how do we do it? Because like clearly the people listening into this are keen to learn more and probably have information already. It's the people that don't have the information that are the ones that are most likely to end up having a bad time.
And in the comments, so this was the one I was referring to before from Mihao, who asked, are doofs the best place for people to trip for the first time? And I know as a dance-wise key peer educator for over a decade as well, there are many people that I've trips at who have decided that a big, loud, sensorial experience of a festival is the best place to experience psychedelic drugs for the first time. And Mihao is asking, is that the right place, or should we be cultivating some kind of rights to pass culture on and have it in a more sacred setting? And there was a bit of discussion. I noted in the comments that one of the things that I am most sort of fearful of with the psychedelic space is that it is a powerful space, and that I worry, and I have seen examples of people overlaying their version of sacred, their version of divinity, and using that psychedelic space to essentially perpetuate their own idea of these fundamentally, introspective questions, and that kind of thing worries me a little bit. But at the same time, you can have a secular, sacred type space. So I'm interested what each of you think on first times.
I'd just like to say that I think that dance floors are sacred spaces, and I've been missing them. So yeah, they can be. I think it really depends on every aspect of the setting, right? It depends on exactly who you're hanging out with. If you're with trusted friends or just people that you have rapport with at the festival, that's going to be good. And it depends how well set up the festival is, whether you're enjoying the music and everything. But festivals could be a great space for a psychedelic experience, but it also could be a little bit overstimulating.
Yeah, I've grappled with this for many years because, this idea of projecting sacredness onto something. So for me, psilocybin mushrooms, for some reason I project some sort of sacredness onto it, and the idea of using those at a festival just seems sacrilegious. And I am grateful that I have a close friend and colleague who I don't think will mind me outing her, since she's outed herself in public before, Monica Barrett. Really challenged me on that and said, people could have a very therapeutic experience with mushrooms, in that sort of environment, and then went on to talk about her own experience with getting therapeutic effects from MDMA and reducing her social anxiety on the dance floor under the influence of MDMA. So clearly, that it's not black and white, and there's not a right way to do things or a wrong way to do things, and you can have epiphanies and life-changing experiences in that sacred space that Steph talked about as being the dance floor, and that makes me feel a bit better about people taking mushrooms on the dance floor too, because it's a sacred space.
I think the one thing I'd want to mention just in regards to evaluating if an intention or a setting is sacred or not, I think that's all interesting and good, and if you like that, you should pursue that. But at the same time, I kind of fear that sacred use might, like medical use, kind of create this hierarchy with recreational use beneath that. And I think that's an issue. And not to say that there wouldn't be other forms of use too, but we can't define what's sacred or spiritual or what any type of drug use is for someone. People are going to do it. They're going to do it their way, and we have to support them.
And so in a utopian society, and maybe in 20 years from now, who knows, I would like to see see psychedelic retreats, which aren't necessarily set up as, or there could be a variety of them, a heterogeneous, different types of psychedelic retreats. So some might be run by chaplains that are coming from more of that perspective. Some might be more around personal growth, or if you're, you're just a thinker and you want to ponder the meaning of life, or you're stuck on a problem at work, that you can go to one of these psychedelic retreats. And I think that would make the ideal, that would create the ideal place for people to have those initial psychedelic experiences that they can then learn from and then use in other places that people may not think about. So we've been talking about festivals. Another great spot to use psychedelics is an art gallery or a museum or something like that. But again, you probably don't want to be doing that first time you take it, because when you see the security guard there, you're probably going to freak out and have what Liam was describing, a bad time as a consequence of all of the other social constructed stuff that's going on.
Challenging.
I suspect many people in one ecstatic moment or another have had utopian visions of just how we could be, nurturing the psychedelic space a little bit better. And Steve's just touched on his. Would love to hear your sort of utopian visions, Steph and Liam, and also drop yours in the comments. What's your, just have free range. If we didn't have to worry about things like prohibition and our culture's hang-ups with psychedelics, how should we, how can we nurture this experience? But Steph or Liam, would love to hear your visions.
Visions, yeah, like I do find that often when we're moments like this, we're talking about psychedelics, we're thinking about psychedelics, and I think that a lot of emphasis is put on the mind. But I really think that for me, the psychedelic experience is more about what we feel, how we feel, and it's a heart space experience. I don't really visualize or think about something necessarily like a utopia to do with psychedelics. I just really am grateful for the sense of connection that a psychedelic experience can produce.
I don't think I have a specific utopian experience either beyond complete drug reform earth-wide. But I mean, in terms, I think psychedelics are a really powerful thing. And the challenge, I think, of trip sitting sometimes is trying to create a container for someone's experience without influencing their experience too much. But integration is part of it, intentionally influencing it in order to make it fit into society, and what things we're integrating and keeping and what things maybe we're not trying to keep. It's a really difficult ethical question, and it kind of boils down to what the hell are we doing as a human population on Earth? And we have no idea. But there's a lot of things I think we need to resolve in order to even imagine the psychedelic utopia. And one thing I think about psychedelics is it's super powerful, and for sure we could use it to achieve my dreams or your dreams or someone else's dreams, but it's going to look real different depending on who decides. And I think there's a power imbalance in the world right now, and there's a risk that psychedelics could just be appropriated into this colonizing regime, and we're back in Brave New World again.
Sorry, we'll quickly move through because we'd love to get to some Q&A. And this next question does cover some of the questions that have been asked about some of the other services that are out there. But what psychedelic harm reduction services would each of you like to see made more available? And in the chat, there has been discussion about things like Zendo project in the US as a project of MAPS, a Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, and also the recent launch of the Fireside project, which is an online project. But here in Australia, perhaps we should start with you, Steph, as DanceWise provide psychedelic harm reduction services at events here in Victoria and in New South Wales as well.
So when it comes to harm reduction, I think it's really important that a service is authentic and localized. So it's like what works for the specific community that is being served. Like nothing without us, nothing about us without us. And so I think that it would be great to have a proliferation of services like DanceWise, not necessarily branded as such, but like sticking to the TRIPSIT principles, and that those services should exist wherever they're needed. So ideally within each jurisdiction, if different events are able to resource such services and develop their own care spaces. And this maybe touches on some of the questions that have come up in regards to formal certification. Like I think it's important that there is, accountability and that the services are in some ways standardized because they had the same values, but they should also be unique enough to serve what's needed in the local setting and be authentic. So I guess that's a really vague explanation, but just more interest in harm reduction wherever it seems to be needed would be great. And then Liam's already mentioned just law reform in general would actually help services. Like law reform in regards to drugs would help not just harm reduction services, but alcohol and other drug treatment services. And it would be great to see some drug checking, pill testing going on as well.
I think, going back to that idea of the values, the values shift, I think that it's great that we're able to have this conversation and sort of have a nuanced conversation around psychedelic drugs. I worry that some people and some organisations are becoming a little bit evangelistic about it all. And my concern there is that there's this idea that psychedelics are going to change the world. And I think that, we need to change the world to create space for psychedelics. And I think it's not an either or in that there is some synergy there, but I don't think we can just expect that, that the ayahuasca plants and the mushrooms are going to change the world for us just by us consuming them. We need to make some of that change.
And I don't think we said like the really simple answer to this question in terms of the psychedelic harm reduction that we reckon we're going to see. Hopefully, because we're not going to get the drug reform, let's be honest. But I reckon we might be able to get drug checking, and I reckon we might be able to get more integration services. That maybe we can do.
And to me, the integration is what then is that synergy between the two. Is because how can people integrate their experience if we don't have a community where there's a space for psychedelics? And it becomes a circular argument, but we can have better integration as society creates a space for psychedelics and a place to talk about these experiences.
And before we get onto our Q&A, and if you do have questions, do keep them coming on in the comment section. Our moderators are watching the questions and will be bringing those to us in just a tick. Liam, how does psychedelic harm reduction relate to ethnobotany and the environment?
Well, I think the most obvious example is identification. You don't want to eat the wrong mushrooms because best case scenario, it doesn't work. Worst case scenario, you die. So I think that's one important dimension. Also, cultural traditions, both in the sense of people that have been doing a certain practice for a long amount of time. They have that is perhaps a harm reduction practice within that culture. I guess the question of can we as outsiders participate in that, and what does that mean for harm reduction? I reckon that's super messy, and I don't have an answer for you. But I do think that we need to generate our own cultural traditions. And I think some of these conversations around doof culture and dance floors are an interesting way to think about how they might evolve, but then also how do they evolve in a COVID online remote environment too? So maybe there are a chance for a variety of different traditions that could be developed in, contemporary colonial psychedelic culture. Also, I think there is a definite theme within use of psychedelics of people tapping into kind of deep ecology style philosophy where they, feel at one with their environment or whatever. And I think then that kind of brings about thoughts about conservation and changing your perspective on your environment and how to relate to it. I'm personally really into psychoactive plants, and even looking at my own journey and things I did when I was young, and I was like, "Ooh, legal high, that's interesting." But my approach now is very different. Like, it's changed how I look at how I engage with those plants. And now when I look at it, I think, what does it mean if I cut you down? Or what does it mean if I plant you here? And I think there's something about all of this that takes you along that journey, and then also ties into what I was talking about, this new entheogenic movement now where we're using the good things about psychedelics to push reform. And I think conservation is one thing. Everyone in the psychedelic community, no one wants to destroy our environment. When people understand an issue, they try to change it. And I think, hey, that's a good poster boy thing for drug reform. So I think that's a cool thing. And good plug for EGA's new peyote resource. Check it out, conservation.
Yes, yeah, I was just about to mention the new peyote resource, which you can download, gardenstates.entheogenesis.org/resources. We'll get our moderators to drop that in there. And it's just one of many resources that are popping up. This is the psilocybin one as well, from Entheogenesis Australis, that are covering some of those ethnobotanical issues as well, especially that relationship with conservation with environment. So we're going to go to some questions now. Our first question, we'll wait. Hopefully we'll have a question. Oh, it's coming. I can see it. It's on the way. Thank you for everyone who has dropped those questions in. Do keep them coming. We'll try and get to as many as we can before our brains are mush and we cannot continue doing any more questions. But when we do reach that point, I'll remind you as well that everyone here is on social media, and you can find us all on social media, whether it's direct social media like Stephen is on Twitter, or whether you head to dancewise.org.au and you can find resources, or you can find out if you're an event promoter, perhaps, although it's not really the time to talk about event promotion, but when it does, put it in your bookmarks for later. And you are in Victoria or New South Wales and you want to engage Dancewise services, or if you want to find out about Liam's research and the sorts of things that he has been up to, all of those things you can find out, and also follow EGA on the various social platforms. So our first question for this evening, still waiting for my question, is there anything about harm reduction that we should keep in mind during COVID times, like tips for better trips during COVID? And I suppose this is not just talking about COVID as in somebody having COVID, but under lockdown, under restrictions.
Well, I mean, something that I think people need to be aware of, I mentioned earlier that whenever you're using from an unregulated market, there's sort of inherent risks. You don't know what you're getting. The unregulated market, the illicit market, is more adulterated now than previously due to lockdowns, due to restrictions, in the same way that it's impacted, a range of other legal supplies. so just be conscious of the adulterated market, and then also just be really conscious of the impacts, like the subtle as well as the incredibly dramatic impacts that just this last year and a half has had on everyone's mindset and just overall well-being. So be really kind and gentle to yourself. Be aware of the fact that your tolerance may have gone down. Just be aware that we've been subject to kind of cumulative trauma over the last year and a half, and to take things really, really easy.
Any other?
Set and setting, and the setting is not ideal. You do you, but keep it in mind.
Well, it's really interesting because there's been such an increase in the use of things like LSD during COVID, and that first blew my mind. Why would you want to take acid while you're in lockdown? But I think that in terms of the setting, at least it is a familiar setting. It's not out somewhere in the bush where you don't know how to get home again, or it is actually a safe environment. And ideally, if you're able to do it with somebody, ideally that you're living with, but at least remotely. Liam, you talked about the idea of remote trip sitting and how that might work. And I think the final thing for me, thinking about people being in lockdown and wanting to have a psychedelic experience for whatever reason, it's really important to ensure that the preparation work takes place. And that might mean that a particular part of your house where you're planning on having that experience is not being used for the period of time, that you're doing all of those self-care things that Steph was talking about, in addition to other things in your preparation for the journey.
Like risk manage your house.
Next question. I would be interested to know about post-trip support, in particular around sleep and daily performance for up to 7 days, nights after the experience.
Well, we were talking about integration services, and ideally that would be part of it, but we also talked about how there's not a lot of access to it. I think trying to maintain some kind of regular routine with the additional, self-care and time that you might require to deal with whatever new or complicated things that it might have brought up. But I think it's pretty standard self-care advice. Just be extra kind to yourself.
Yeah, and planning that downtime so that you've got an opportunity to not just rest, but to consolidate the experience and try to spend some time thinking about what that means for you, what it means for the people around you, what it means for you connecting with other people, particularly at the moment. I feel that that being, just repeating Steph's message, being kind to yourself and being able to not only prepare but also prepare in advance to have some downtime, so that you have the opportunity to do some of that work that might increase the benefit, maximize the benefit of the experience.
Can the panel discuss how to tell if somebody is, and this is just after yesterday, August 31st, is International Overdose Awareness Day, and I need to make this scroll. Sorry, that's I like to have the questions up there. You can see them in the comment sections regardless, but what to do if somebody is overdosing, and maybe just pull apart that word a little bit as well. What is an overdose when we're talking about psychedelics, and at what point should a trip sitter be calling for further help, external help?
Yeah, so obviously an overdose is anything that the body it can't handle. If that was on something like MDMA, some of the signs might be like someone's overheating, agitation, confusion, uncontrolled movements, like not able to stop moving their legs, ocular clonus, like the eye wobbles. If you see anything like that, there's a risk of serotonin syndrome, and you should be calling 000 straight away. If it's something like LSD, it's harder to define what an overdose is, but assuming it is LSD, then like the physical risks are reasonably minimal. So you can work with some of those grounding practices, see if you can establish rapport, return to breath, maybe help like with the change of setting, giving someone some water, those kind of things. If there's a risk that it might not have been LSD, again, look for any of those signs of overheating and agitation, and just call 000 if you're seeing that. But then if it's other kind of overdoses, if someone's losing consciousness and they're not able to respond to voice prompts, then again, just call 000. Essentially, if your instinct is telling you that something isn't quite right, there's no harm in calling for emergency services. If anything, just don't delay.
But this is why we were saying, P, there's a preference for trip sitters that are experienced with the drug in question, because if you are with someone that smokes 5-MeO DMT and you don't know what that's like, but you've taken acid, so you expect it's going to be like that, the person passes out and vomits, you go, I've got to call emergency services. The person wakes up in 2 minutes later and is feeling okay, and now you've got a kind of complicated situation on your hands. So it's hard to navigate, and I'm not saying you shouldn't call someone if someone's vomiting and passing out, for sure. But if this person has done 5-MeO 20 times and half of those times this has happened, it might change how you react to the situation.
Yeah, I think so. So the drug that's being taken is obviously really important in being able to talk about what an overdose is, distinguishing between what we might call a challenging experience, so a psychological overdose of just taken too much, and now the world is vibrating really hard, people are going into a potential short brief period of psychosis versus the physiological overdose, which is quite different. And I think regardless of Steph was sort of saying, if in doubt, call 000. Certainly my experience from speaking to people who have been in that sort of situation. So there's one that's really front of mind at the moment involving cactus, where the person had consumed cactus and that's all they had consumed. The person that was trip sitting them knew that it was cactus, so it should be, it should be fairly safe, but the person was starting to lose consciousness. So they rang 000, the paramedics arrived. By the time the paramedics arrived, I think the person was still in a state of distress. They thought they were dying. But as soon as they put the buttons on, checked the ECG, took the person's pulse, the paramedic said, look, your blood pressure's up, your heart rate's a little fast, but it's not abnormal. So you can either sort of ride this out here or you can come for a ride with us to the hospital. And the person said, thank you so much. I'm just going to ride it out here, but thank you so much for coming and checking on me. And it didn't cost anything for the paramedic to come out and do that. That was in Victoria.
Fun tip.
I'm not sure.
If you are somebody who likes to analyze yourself, you can actually buy for about $50 from a pharmacy those little oximeters. So if you really like to monitor yourself, and look, they're a handy thing to have in a first aid kit. But if you like to do that sort of thing, it can go awry as well. You can be obsessive over that sort of thing. So be careful.
Blood pressure is the same. Your blood pressure is going to go up when you're tripping. And so that's quite normal. But if you start to obsess about that, then you worry more and you become fixated on that. But I think all those things are cheap. They are relatively cheap devices. If you're doing a lot of trip sitting, that are worth having on hand. So at least if you're concerned about the other person, you can check their oxygen and you can check their blood pressure.
Secondly, to this question, what's the best strategy to deal with people in a dark trip that might become, and trigger warning here, for suicidal ideation, or if people become aggressive toward others. So I suppose it's both aggressive toward themselves and towards others. What are some strategies?
I'd be reluctant to give a prescriptive response in this context. Like, something you could do that's proactive is maybe do an online mental health first aid course, so you can get an idea of how to respond to a mental health crisis. Something, just because this has come up, and I appreciate that you gave a trigger warning as well, Nick, maybe just people should be aware of like what kind of numbers could you call if you were looking for support. So of course there's 000, and that can connect you with the crisis response team that might be able to come out. But if you just need someone to speak to over the phone, there's Lifeline and Beyond Blue. I'm not sure, Nick, if you're able to share those numbers with people, or I do have them here.
We'll get our moderators to share those.
Yeah, so Lifeline 131114 and Beyond Blue 1300 224 636. But yeah, I'd recommend spending a bit more time and doing a whole course. And if anything is beyond like your capacity to respond in a particular moment, just seek emergency services. But Steve as well, this is your field, I think.
I would just say, in addition to that, you need to know your limitations and don't work outside of your scope that you feel capable and comfortable of working within. But it goes back to, the key principles of whether it's trip sitting or psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, regardless of what's happening, trying to remain as calm as possible so it doesn't escalate the situation, and doing as much as you can to de-escalate the situation. And that might be moving the person into another room, into another space, reducing stimulation, and being curious and finding out what it is that is distressing them and is leading to their agitation and potentially their aggression, and sort of being curious about that, and also trying to what I found is helpful is engaging the person in some consequential thinking. So, okay, that's what you believe at the moment, and you want to do X or Y. And if you do X or Y, what's going to happen? And get the person just to talk through that, so that it allows them to just process it. And then, as Steph said, if it's getting to a point where you don't think you're able to manage it, you're concerned about the person's safety or your safety, then your safety and their safety trumps anything, and you have to bring in appropriate services.
If I may just add one extra point as well in regards, if someone's having a really if they're agitated during their psychedelic experience, or if someone's agitated and they're not necessarily expressing any particular ideas, but they might be exhibiting is it keening, that sort of animal-like noises, or possibly experiencing Nick, you might be able to help me with this. The term, it slipped my mind, that Marla has provided us a training video on. The point I was going to make is that it's important not to actually restrain a person.
Are you talking about the rock and the water?
Pardon?
Rock and water? Is that
LSD induces a state that's like psychosis, but then another really animated presentation during a psychedelic experience. And it's completely escaped me right now, the term for it. It's in drug-related first aid, and we should be able to recall it. But it's really important not to restrain a person, like say where you're calling 000, because that can actually, that can actually cause death, possibly from like clotting the stress hormones. But yeah.
Well, yeah,
essentially, a person's in a fight, having a fight-flight reaction, and so often when people have experienced trauma, they go into a freeze situation, and so they're not able to release that energy. It's sort of an evolutionary, it's an evolutionary system, so that if an animal's being eaten by another animal, they just sort of freeze and flop and don't experience the pain, and so. Psychedelics, and particularly MDMA, can lead to the body remembering some of those past experiences, and they can come up through the fight-flight response. And it might seem like the person is aggressive, but all they need to do is just get the energy out through dance or through whatever means possible, but just to allow this energy that's within them to get out of them. And not only will they will it de-escalate the situation, but it will also potentially have some therapeutic benefit, because they've been holding something within them that needs to come out of their body.
And I just want to add here that it is a really complex and difficult area, because I have seen in experience over 10 years people who are concerned about what's going on and want to escalate it to emergency services, when I'm looking at that and going, no, there's not a problem there, and your escalation will escalate the scenario. So you need to be careful with your impact on what's going on as well. And just also a comment in the comment section from Jeff Baker from Australian Psychedelic Society in Sydney, who points out that it can be good to have just sugar lollies and things like that on hand, because glucose levels can drop, especially during long trips, and that can just lead to mood swings and things like that. Sometimes it really is as simple as somebody hasn't had enough water, or had their blood sugar level is dropping, that's leading to a bad experience. Sometimes all somebody needs is an apple, not 000, You
become really aware of all of your really subtle bodily functions. The term I was forgetting before is excited delirium, if anyone wants to research that.
Yes,
yeah.
and there have been numerous cases over the past 5 to 10 years of people who have passed away because they have been restrained by police, by security, who were experiencing excited delirium. In fact, there's one very famous one, the founder of Earthcore. I won't go further on that, but that's what happened. Okay, let's go to another question. Keeping trip killers, antipsychotics on hand are sometimes used as a back-out option when the experience is too much, and to help in reducing anxiety. Is that safe practice? Stephen, do you want to start us off?
No. Just based on my clinical experience, I think trip attenuators might be helpful. Things like benzodiazepines, diazepam, any of the PAMs can be useful in reducing agitation and even aggression.
Anxiety and body tension, the benzodiazepines, that's known to be a decent combination.
My concern with antipsychotics and what I've seen is it actually does really just rip the person out of the situation so fast that it can be traumatic. And I've worked with the casualties of people. We on one hand, as Steph was talking about, the 000s, and we're trying to. It's a really difficult balance, because I've seen patients who have had their loved one or whatever called 000. They've ended up going through the emergency department, were administered quetiapine or one of the many others antipsychotics that are available, and they have developed significant mental health issues after that. I don't think that it's a good idea to abort a trip with an antipsychotic. I think if you can ride it out with ideally write it out with nothing, but if you really need something, benzodiazepines are the best safety medication to ride it out rather than just be ripped out of the matrix, sort of the plug pulled straight out of your head. It's not the best way to exit that situation.
Also, I think it's a bit of a contraindications question, and hopefully someone will link to the trip sit chart in the chat, because I think that's always a good starting point if you're thinking about mixing drugs. But we didn't talk about SSRIs, which I think is important considering we're talking about serotonin agonists like psychedelics. Most of the classic psychedelics don't seem to have a high risk of physiological overdose unless they are combined with something like an SSRI that also is impacting upon the serotonin receptor. So you should normally not be heaps concerned unless you're mixing. Investigate the situation first and don't let your anxiety get taken away with you just because you're stressed and you're having a hard time. Obviously, be aware what's going on. But I think it's mostly a risk for MDMA overdose, or if you're combining psychedelics with other things that mess with serotonin, then you should really be looking into what that combination is, because there's a whole bunch of annoying stuff going on there. And that's going to play in with ayahuasca and shanga in particular, because there are things that mess with your serotonin up in there. So be careful with serotonin combinations and use that chart.
Yeah, I think the SSRIs tend to reduce the effect of psychedelic drugs. And so one of the problems I've seen is not serotonin syndrome as a result of a person mixing psychedelics with an SSRI, but rather a person ceasing their SSRI so that they can have a psychedelic experience. And it's called discontinuation syndrome by the psychiatry and medical fraternity, but it's essentially a potentially life-threatening withdrawal syndrome. So you don't want to stop taking that medication either. I think with SSRIs, they are actually relatively safe with most of the classic psychedelics, excluding ayahuasca because of the monoamine oxidase inhibitor in there, and with changa with the monoamine oxidase inhibitor in there. With MDMA, the risk of overdose is similar. It's because people aren't getting the effect that they want, so they take more and they take more, and they end up overdose. They end up with serotonin syndrome through the MDMA overdose rather than the interaction of it with the SSRI medication. But there's so many antidepressants out there. There's SNRIs, SSRIs, MAOIs, tricyclic antidepressants. So it does get kind of messy, and it's hard to give a clear-cut answer to that question.
So another question, moving on to your opinions on the rise of ketamine clinics in America, where trip-sitting psychotherapy is being provided online. I'm not sure of the entire context of this. I know that ketamine is provided, I think, in Australian settings as well. Sorry, I can't further the context on the US settings there, but if you'd like to, one of you would like to take that one.
I want to hear Steve delineate ketamine psychotherapy from MDMA psychotherapy and psilocybin psychotherapy.
Yes, please.
I actually don't know that much about ketamine psychedelic therapy, to be honest. And, usually the way ketamine has been used up until recently is with fairly high dose infusions for depression, and it has effects lasting somewhere between 3 and 6 weeks, where people after the infusion go from having a major clinical episode to being symptom-free. And we don't understand why that works. The reason I say I don't really understand how ketamine assisted psychotherapy works is because of it being a dissociative. It may be more like the old school, what's it called? Not psychedelic therapy, but psycholytic therapy, where they in the olden days, in that second wave of research in continental Europe, rather than giving people heroic doses of LSD and seeing what happens, which is what they were doing in the US, they were giving people not microdoses, but 50, 100 mics of LSD, and doing that within the context of psychodynamic therapy. And I actually don't know that much about ketamine psychotherapy, but I suspect maybe that's That's my hypothesis at the moment based on my limited knowledge. Psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy is pretty much everything that I've been talking about when I've been linking trip sitting to psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and separate from psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy or psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy is MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. And the main difference there being is that it's far more it's far more interaction that's going on, because the person is able to communicate. You know, if a person is having a deep mystical experience, they might want to tell the trip sitter about that, but it's very difficult to communicate and articulate the ineffable. With the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, people's prefrontal cortex, parts of it are turned on associated with language, and so they're able to articulate their traumatic experience better than they were before taking the MDMA, and they do want to communicate, and in turn, it's much more scary, in my opinion, to be working with MDMA than psilocybin. Even though psilocybin is so unpredictable, you have all the best intentions in the world, but you'd never know where it's going to take you to. Going into this field, having done harm reduction work and sort of seen my own circle of friends using MDMA, I thought, this is going to be fun. We'll give patients MDMA. They're going to have a fantastic time. And that is not the case at all. It's so unpredictable because you're working with people that have trauma, and that compounds the complexity of it. And the MDMA amplifies, as does psilocybin, the transference process. So people are more likely to project figures from the past onto the therapists. And so that can happen with psilocybin, though often, people may not be able to even communicate or articulate exactly what's going on, where what I've seen in MDMA therapy is people replaying out old relationship dynamics with particularly the male therapist who they were perceiving to be the person that sexually abused them, and just playing that out. And, going back to all of the, trusting in the process, having watched someone who's, very well skilled in this, Michael Mithoff, he just seemed to handle it so well and provided what we call in psychotherapy a corrective emotional response, which is not what that father figure who sexually abused her would have said, but actually provided a therapeutic response to that. And similarly, when the patient participant had the overnight stay, and they started the integration session the next morning, because the integration is a little different as well with MDMA versus psilocybin. When they were doing that session, the person was aware of what had happened, and she was really distressed that, she said these horrible things to Michael, and what a lovely person Michael was, and how, because she must be such a terrible person to have said those things. And again, he just stayed really cool, calm, and collected, and said that's what had to happen. And I was there to help that process unfold. That's what we're here to do.
Another question, I suppose, further to that, and I think part of that question as well was, and I guess this is maybe lockdown relevant, but how to deal with this setting when the trip sitting might be provided by an online source. But the question that I have now is, do you have any tips for people who like to use dissociatives in a solo setting, and to warn others not to panic if they are disturbed / found in this state, that they did this with intention? So maybe just comments on, again, it's a sort of the solo experience and perhaps remote trip sitting.
I think the key there is telling somebody what you're doing, because I've seen this go pear-shaped too, where somebody has taken a dissociative, maybe without the intention of K-holing, but, didn't quite get the dose right. And they were just hoping to take the edge off, and other people at a campsite have seen them in a K-hole state and have been really concerned, and taken them to paramedical services, and And in that instance, I was actually with Dancewise, and the paramedics came over and asked me to see what was going on, and we kind of figured out what had happened. It actually wasn't to do with dosage. He'd taken the wrong baggie. He had MDMA and ketamine with him, and this was when methoxetamine was going around, which has high bioavailability orally. So he'd obviously dropped the wrong baggie. And luckily, you know, given that environment and that great relationship between the paramedics and the Dancewise crew, and the fact that his friends were there that carried him in, I said, I think this is what might be going on. And he's probably having a wonderful time at the moment because his eyes were open, even though he couldn't communicate. And as we talked for a little bit longer, and I said, look, I think give it 20, 30 minutes, he should start coming back to normal. And there's, you know, just monitor him because everything else seemed fine. His heart rate was a bit fast. His blood pressure was a bit high, but it was nothing from a medical perspective to be concerned about, apart from the fact this person seemed to be catatonic. And just as we were sort of finishing that up, he said one word, something like, and we went, great, you know, this isn't an overdose situation. This is someone that's just had an awesome time on methoxetamine. But the importance of telling people, so in that instance, even though they carried him in, because he had told them that he had taken MDMA, at least by him telling them, you know, what he had on him, we were able to figure out what was going on, and it didn't mean that he got rushed to hospital unnecessarily. And so it's just so important to communicate to people, what your intention is, what you're doing, so that when people do see you in that dissociative state, that they don't panic, and that and that there's some sort of parameters so that, you know, they know when you've taken it and when you should be starting to come back somewhat compos mentis, at least to be able to communicate, so that it isn't unnecessarily escalated, and also that we don't, you know, the person hasn't had an opioid overdose and we're not leaving them there to die because they've had an opioid overdose. So it's just so important to tell people what you think you're having.
I didn't think I would be bringing novel harm reduction tools here, but maybe a Sharpie if you've got multiple baggies hanging around with nondescript white powders, and just write something. Doesn't have to be the thing, as long as it's something that distinguishes the things between each other. Oh dear.
I think in a situation like that, because there was paramedics on hand, they were able to check the signs, check the person's vitals. And so with ketamine, the heart rate is usually within the normal range or even a bit elevated. But if someone's had a depressant, then there'll be the signs of a depressant drug, such as, you know, lower breath rate and heart rate. So, yeah, maybe just applying first aid to the scene and checking, what is the person's signs.
And again, that goes back to the importance of having those basic things on hand, like a blood pressure machine, or which takes pulse and blood pressure. And Nick was talking about oxygen, so you can actually check on people and just make sure their vitals are okay.
Mm-hmm.
Our next question, and we're nearing the end of our Q&A, so thank you everyone who has joined us and who has asked a question. Remember that the conversation continues on social media, so do follow EGA on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever is your social media platform of choice. And our question here, what are the panel's thoughts of the importance or need for therapists to have had their own psychedelic experience? And I think we have touched on that a little bit, but let's touch on it once more.
Well, I think from the perspective of trip sitting outside of a therapy setting, it's definitely immediately clear from the Forum study that there was a demand for people with lived psychedelic experience. And I'd imagine Steph's experience aligns with that, working for a peer-based organisation. I do know that there is a reasonable amount, well, not reasonable, not much at all, but there is some literature that suggests that therapists should have a psychedelic experience. And I believe that's part of the MAPS protocol, which segue to Steve. Tell us about it.
It's actually trying to be replicated now in Canada and hopefully soon in Australia with psilocybin, because I agree 100% that that people that are working in this space therapeutically and administering substances to people need to be familiar with the terrain and have navigated some of that themselves, not just to give empathy, but to also just have some idea of what that person's going through. I think it is critical. And it's really positive that we seem to be moving back to that model, because back in the 60s, that was actually part of standard practice. You wouldn't give a psychedelic to a person unless you had consumed it yourself as the psychiatrist. Swiss and German health authorities required that therapists in psychedelic research first take the drug as specified by the protocol which they were working within. As a psychologist, I teach my students and provisional, psychology interns that if you're going to administer a psychometric tool to somebody, then you need to do it yourself first, because if it's a 500-item test, you might get halfway through it and go, Jesus, this is tedious. Well, if it's tedious for you, it's going to be tedious for them too. And so I think it applies in that respect as well. And I'm actually drawing here from the Phelps paper I mentioned before with the competencies. Phelps says that the Czech model in the 1950s required each psychedelic psychotherapist to have had at least 5 personal sessions with a psychedelic drug, and they have had to have co-facilitated 30 sessions as a guide before being able to work on their own.
And we're nearing the end again. A question that was asked, I think, very early on, and I think we've covered a little bit of this as well, but in the US, a recently launched project, a peer support hotline and app called the Fireside Project was launched, and this was only the past couple of months. Have you all heard of it? And is there something similar in Australia?
Steph? I think the answer is no, and Steph will be able to tell us what's the next best thing.
Within the ABLE network, so that's the national peak, and there's peer-based drug user organizations across the country. There's a few things that aren't necessarily 24 hours. Like if you're in Victoria, you can get in contact with HRVIC on the website, hrvic.org.au. If you're preferring a telephone line, we've got an inbound phone line for people who are seeking support when it comes to their pharmacotherapy. That's the PAMS program. In New South Wales, newer, they have the Peer Line, which has been launched, I think, this year, or maybe it was last year. In Queensland, Quinn has recently launched High Ground, which is a website which has online chat function. So there's little bits and pieces going on, but I'm not familiar with Fireside, and I'm really keen to check that out. Is that possibly a 24-hour sort of number? It's having the capacity to be able to respond when people are needing it the most. So that is always a struggle, but you can definitely reach out to your jurisdiction's peer-based org.
Yeah, I think I have had a little bit of a look at the Fireside project, and it's made up of a lot of volunteers from organisations like Dance Safe in the US, which is a sort of another peer organisation very similar to Dance Wise here in Australia, and also people from Zendo Project. It was only very recently launched, so I don't know if anybody in the chat has had any experience with Fireside. Please do drop in your experience if you have had an experience. I know it's an idea that has been floating around for a while, especially with the rise of things like Discord and these really interactive chat environments. Even going back to the old bulletin board forums, there were boards dedicated to helping people with trips. I don't know how effective they are or how useful people find them. Like me personally, I find that if I'm under the influence of a psychedelic enough that I could be running into trouble, my eyes don't work on screens. Everything turns into like those like Alison Gray symbols that you see that she does at Chapel of Sacred Mirrors in the US. It's all that. I'm like, I can't read English anymore. It doesn't work. So interfacing with a screen and plus all of the, like, for some reason, every time I encounter a completely novel technical problem that has never happened before, and I'm convinced that it's the computer doing it on purpose. The computer has become autonomous, and it's doing it on purpose. So I don't know. I would find it really difficult to interface with digital technologies if I'm really that deep. Go on.
I wish we had video footage of you doing this, because you may not even be using a phone or computer. You're probably talking to your refrigerator.
I just aside from those services, and I get exactly what you're saying, Nick, but even in the most intense psychedelic experience, you can usually phone somebody. You can usually figure out how to phone somebody who that you ideally you can trust and have that conversation. And whether they can come and check in on you or whatever that might be, but just reaching out to somebody with a phone is far simpler than trying to use some of the technologies. Just speed dial, have the trusted people in your phone up the front so you can get in there easy and call somebody that you can trust to talk through whatever it is you're going through.
Yep, somebody else just mentioned on Reddit there is the TripSit subreddit, which is just r/TripSit, which is moderated by, I think, some of the same people that do the TripSit chart. I think it is from them. I'm just looking at the symbol of it. It looks like it's the same. But again, they can be really useful for before and after, but I've seen some really bizarre and I'm not sure how helpful threads on there. So but it's a new area, and it's an area that people are exploring and looking for. How can we use this? How can we use technology to engage with people, especially while we're all in isolation, sitting here in my digital corner here. But we're all separate right now, and we've been talking about Garden State's event. We're not going to be able to be together in December, and people are still choosing to use substances. I know that use has been down according to some of the latest stats, but that's not zero. It's an area for innovation. If you have ideas, that's the conversation. That's the conversation following today's microdose webcast, I think.
Yeah, just one final on that, on the online forums. I mean, I'm not across Reddit. I'm an old man now. I'm not keeping up with the trends of the young people today. But in the old days, there's blue light bulletin boards, and people would purposely let people know on the discussion board that, hey, I'm about to take this drug at this dose, and it's this time. And I'm not sure. If anybody on the board knew that person well enough that they could check in on them, but it was like a live, account of sort of where they were at. So they'd check in every hour and sort of say, oh, yeah, feeling better now, whatever. But it goes back to that point, Nick, that I just couldn't see how you could even type on a keyboard in that sort of state. And I'm not sure. I feel like when people were doing that, it was more for themselves so that they felt a sense of safety that somebody out there knows what I'm doing. Though I'm not sure that it's particularly helpful, because if things do go pear-shaped or the person doesn't check in, and they haven't replied again in 6 hours, is it because they've collapsed and had a fall, or is it that they can't type on their keyboard anymore? So I think there is some real limitations around the technology, and I'm not sure how we move forward to develop better systems other than the old phone and just speed dial of your closest contacts that you trust.
Well, and I won't go too far into this, but I know that Splendor in the Grass did happen this year, and it happened in a fully virtual reality sort of a scenario. I found it really bizarre. The police had a virtual presence at a virtual festival, but we didn't have a virtual harm reduction presence. We didn't have a virtual harm reduction tent. Bizarre, but I think it was more of a branding exercise. But these are the spaces that are more and more people are entering, but they are still choosing to use substances in their own homes. Thank you, everyone, for
Could you buy virtual drugs, Nick?
Well, have you seen some of the things that virtual reality goggles can do? It's just pretty incredible. Our final question tonight is on MDMA and serotonin syndrome, specifically regarding rapid eye movement. And I did have the word for that. Bruxia?
No, that's
sorry, what?
Sorry. Ocular clonus is the rapid eye movements, and bruxism is gurning.
Right, yep.
Yeah.
Early warning signs for serotonin syndrome. What should people be watching out for? I think this was also following on from some comments in the chat where people were suggesting that rapid eye movements could be a sign that somebody is heading towards a bad time, but then other people saying, well, hang on a minute, that's what people really enjoy. And this is, again, that careful balance.
I would be looking for serotonin syndrome. I would be looking for confusion. And the person's ability to communicate. I was just saying, one of the wonderful yet scary things about MDMA therapy is people's enhanced ability to communicate. And so if people are not making sense, they're starting to behave bizarrely, and they've only got MDMA on board, then that's a real worry for me that maybe this is the onset of serotonin syndrome. Those are some of the first signs that you see. The person some bizarre behavior, being able to unable to articulate or even communicate, or just not making sense, and knowing if that that's the only drug that they've got on board, or even if you don't, I mean, because as you said, Steph, it's such a tainted market. Who knows what people are putting in their mouths? We hope we're reagent testing, and we hope we know what we're putting in our mouth. But we don't necessarily know what it is. So if someone is starting to demonstrate those signs, then it definitely is worth escalating it, because of the risk of death associated with serotonin syndrome. I think it's worth erring on the side of caution, because there's a rapid decline from that bizarre behavior, or the lack of
agitation.
logic. Agitation, the lack of coherence. It goes very rapidly to them being in an ICU or being dead. It just escalates.
Essentially your body can't stop overheating. And so if the environment is hot, like if it's about 25 degrees or more, which is pretty much every day in summer in Australia, or if it's an indoor event and there's not much ventilation, so if it's hot, they're more vulnerable to serotonin syndrome. And one of the things to be aware of is there is a reasonably fine line between what is still actually feels really pleasurable and the person is reporting how much they're enjoying it, but they're actually they've had maybe a toxic dose, like more than what would be ideal. And they might be experiencing overheating that never needs a medical intervention, but they could actually be doing some harm if that's like the type of dose they used to. So you should be wanting to have something sort of like between like 70 and definitely less than like 150. With serotonin syndrome, I think just be mindful that anything that is uncontrolled movements, even if someone's reporting having a good time, it might be worth at least putting in a lot of effort to cool them down and get hydrated with electrolytes.
I'll just have a sip now of my Electrolytes is a physical embodiment of what you can do very easily to reduce harm, especially on those hot summer days. Thank you to our panelists this evening, and thank you for all your questions in the Q&A. Again, do keep the conversations going on social media, but just want to give a big thank you to Dr. Stephen Bright from Edith Cowan University. Also, do go and check out AOD Media Watch, aodmediawatch.com.au. Fantastic articles coming out all the time. Stephen, thank you very much. Steph, DanceWise, which is a program of Harm Reduction Victoria. dancewise.org.au is where you can go for more information, and you can also reach Steph if you want to contact her on steph@dancewise.org.au. Steph, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And finally, Dr. Liam Engel from Edith Cowan University, who is also an associate editor at AOD Media Watch and a contributor here at EGA. His email, liam@entheogenesis.org. Thank you, Liam.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, and that brings us to the end of our webcast for this evening. Before I finish up, I just want to again mention those fantastic resources, entheogenesis.org/resources. And also, if you would like to hear all the latest on vaping in Australia. It is part of, I guess it's sort of part of, John Safran's doing his book launch in a couple of weeks. So we've got him pretty much as he's launching the book. We will have a copy of his book to give away on the night as well. So do sign up for your chance to get a copy of that. And we'll be doing a wide-ranging Q&A. And just talking about big tobacco and vaping in Australia, gardenstates.org or entheogenesis.org. Either way, you'll be able to find your way to the Microdose webcast. We're also always looking for contributions and feedback. If you have something that you'd like to contribute to the webcast, you can do so at the website. There is an expressions of interest page there as well. And just a reminder as well that Garden States no longer in December, postponement, inevitable postponement because of ongoing restrictions here in Victoria and in New South Wales and in other states and territories in Australia as we bibble and bobble along toward a post-COVID time. Thank you for joining us this evening, and good night.